Palworld. It's like Pokemon, but with guns. So, cooler, I guess. Anyways, we've seen this new wave of internet lawyers and specifically Nintendo fans upset about the intellectual property theft that's going on with Palworld. And while it's cool that everyone on the internet just seems to have become an IP lawyer, I just want to point out a couple of issues that I have with a lot of the arguments that I'm seeing, especially because by their own definition, Nintendo has built its entire empire on stolen or copied IP. And that's a really good thing. First, I want to point out a couple of things. Stolen or copied IP in the last sentence, that was in quotation marks. I don't actually think that they ever stole or copied any IP, but they came close. About as close as Palworld is coming, and I'll get into that in a minute. But more importantly, I want to say this is in no way condoning the theft of artistic assets, plagiarism, anything like that. Stealing somebody's work is very obviously wrong. People put a lot of effort into all sorts of things, artistic or otherwise, especially with computer code, video games, story writing. In any way, taking that and claiming that's your own, it's wrong. But we'll get to that in due time. Today, we're talking about how Nintendo is guilty of all the same things that they accuse other smaller developers of doing in order to get started. Pokemon doesn't own a copyright on things like an elemental cat, an adorable fox-like monster, or I mean, yeah, the monsters look pretty similar, and okay, yeah, the art style between Palworld and the latest Pokemon games is very similar, and you catch the monsters in little balls that you throw at them. For anybody that's played the games, it's about where all the similarities end. And we start running into these shades of gray. Because there's a lot of similarities between the two games, they're not copies of each other, but Palworld does borrow a lot from Pokemon. And again, that's a great thing. Pokemon's a great series with great ideas, and Game Freak and Nintendo don't have a monopoly on great ideas like that. I could do the obvious thing and start talking about how Pokemon originally copied a bunch of its monsters from a game called Dragon Quest, and how it's really hypocritical of them to be upset at other developers from copying from them, just like they copied from Dragon Quest. But the reality of it is, there's tons of other YouTubers that have made this comparison because it is the easiest comparison to make. So I'll bring it up, show the pictures on screen. Hey, look how similar those things are. And I think I'm going to move on to the more important ones. And instead, I'm going to focus on this little game called Metroid. Metroid was released in 1986 on the NES, for anyone who doesn't know. Metroid is an isolating game about a bounty hunter named Samus Aran who travels to an abandoned research facility that's overrun by hostile alien life. The research facility is controlled by the main antagonist, Mother Brain. The whole time, Samus is fighting against enemies like the mini-boss Ridley, who later became a mainstay of the series. Samus is also hunting these little things called Metroids, which are small parasitic organisms that latch onto their victims and absorb their life energy. In the end, there's a race against time to avoid the exploding research facility, and oh yeah, then it's revealed that Samus is a girl, which doesn't mean a lot now, but at the time, it was a huge reveal, especially at a time where video games were all about focusing on that boy audience. It was such a big deal, in fact, that Nintendo actually lied about Samus in the video game manual for Metroid. The manual explicitly called Samus a he on multiple occasions, and it was sort of a way for them to trick boys into playing, because at this time, long story short, video games were only being sold in the toy aisle for boys instead of the toy aisle for girls. So, surprise, Nintendo actually tricked you into being a feminist. Anyways, it's a cool game, totally recommend it if you've never played it. But the thing is, some of those parts that I mentioned sound pretty familiar. Just a few years earlier, in 1979, the movie Alien was released. In the movie, a space crew responds to a distress signal from a research vessel. The ship is controlled by a computer called Mother. The crew are slowly picked off one by one as they try to survive some mysterious alien life form. The larva of that alien life form is parasitic, latches onto the crew's face, impregnates them, and in the end, there's a race against time to leave the research ship before it explodes and takes out the alien. Our hero protagonist isn't even revealed fully as the protagonist, though, until about halfway through the movie, when it's very clear that she's the only one making smart decisions. Again, I know that doesn't sound like much, but in a decade populated with all the Stallones and the Schwarzenegger movies as the main moneymakers, having a woman instead of a hyper-masculine lead was really groundbreaking. And if you're not really convinced of this inspiration, I just want to point out that this was the original design for Ridley, who is, by the way, named after the director of Alien, Ridley Scott. Moving on to the king of all video games, Mario. So Mario starred in his first game, Donkey Kong. The story of the game, if you can call it that, is that a giant monkey man named Donkey Kong stole a woman named Pauline and climbed a tower, and now Mario, the jump man, has to climb the tower and get her back. That's it. That's all we got here. But the idea of a giant monkey carrying a princess up a tower sounds pretty familiar to me. Specifically, it sounds like another Kong. King Kong. Basically, the story is a giant monkey falls in love with a woman. They're on an island called Skull Island. There's dinosaurs on the island, and the people that went with the woman to the island bring the ape back to New York. King Kong takes the woman, climbs the Empire State Building, and people go up and shoot him down with planes. Again, not much story, but it was an old movie. And while in modern day, Donkey Kong and Mario seem to get along pretty well, and Pauline is usually not around anywhere, the origin is still there. But what about video game inspirations? I mean, Palworld is inspired by a video game, so there's a cross-media sort of gap in that, right? Let me introduce you to this little game called Adventure. Released in 1980 on the Atari 2600, this game has you picking up swords, fighting dragons, exploring dungeon mazes, solving puzzles with keys and other tools, and it's just awesome. Gameplay-wise, it's a network of rooms that a little tiny colored square travels between in order to solve these puzzles, and you can take tools from one square to the next. Again, that doesn't sound super impressive right now, but at the time, a lot of the adventure games were all text-based, so this was a huge leap in technology and immersion, and it really laid the foundation for a lot of adventure games, including one other game that I'll bet you're probably thinking of right now, The Legend of Zelda. The original Legend of Zelda came out in 1985 for the NES and has virtually identical gameplay formulas where you play as a small character, travels around from screen to screen, solving puzzles, fighting monsters with swords, exploring dungeons. Don't get me wrong, Zelda is a massive improvement on adventure. I mean, there's actual sprites, it's not just a square. But in the end, that's kind of my point here. Video games are being recognized more and more as art every passing year. And with that, there are certainly thieves that are stealing the intellectual property of these artists and of these developers and all these people that work so hard to create a video game. For example, earlier in 2023, there was a huge scandal for the game Ventura, which ripped assets directly from other developers, and there's no defense for this. The most that they ever did was recolor some of the textures, but that's theft. They didn't pay the developers for any of their work. The developers stumbled upon it on a stream, and ultimately they did end up getting credit, but not from the person that made the game or the team that made the game. They got the credit because the community around everything yelled so loud that now we're talking about them. Fortunately, that actual theft happens every day, and people squabbling about intellectual property theft in this instance with Palworld versus Pokemon is taking away from the much bigger narrative of small indie dev teams getting their hard work stolen from them, which is a serious issue with IP theft that does need to be talked about, especially when we see that they're being stolen by AAA developers. Just like how Capcom stole over 2,000 photos from an independent photographer to put in Resident Evil and Devil May Cry, completely uncredited. I mean, yeah, it was like 4 years ago or something like that, but that's still a pretty big issue. And I don't remember hearing hardly anybody talking about that at the time. Flip side of that, we're also taking away from the innovation that Palworld and their dev team have come up with. And while we do need to draw a firmer line between theft and inspiration, I think we shouldn't start infringing on games that have that inspiration. Because sure, every now and then you're gonna run into a game like Immortals, Phoenix Rising, that is pretty clearly just inspired by Breath of the Wild in the way that it's trying to make some money. But on the flip side of that, you're going to see games that are truly inspired, like Skyrim, Elden Ring, Castlevania, or even Banjo and Kazooie. These games never would have been able to thrive if Zelda had been shut down by Atari when it was first released, or if Mario had been shut down by Universal Studios. Can you imagine? Taking inspiration from our predecessors to improve the formula so that the later generations can do the same thing is an artistic cycle that bridges cultural and generational divides and needs to be encouraged. And maybe that's what fans are most afraid of here. Maybe Pokemon has had its time in the sun. Pokemon's fans have been begging Game Freak for an open world Pokemon game for years. I remember back in high school learning how to mod Skyrim so that I could kind of play a version of Pokemon in that world. And really, from that time period, it should have been very clear to Game Freak, to Nintendo, to all of their developers that fans really desperately want something like this. A free and open world to catch and interact with your little pocket monsters in more than just a glorified menu. I know Pokemon's not going to end because it's too big. I don't see it going away in the future, but Maybe it's time for the Pokemon Company to take a step back and let a new developer take a crack at it, especially if they just can't handle it. Well, anyways, after all that, I'm sure I've managed to alienate most of my Pokemon Nintendo fan audience, but I'm trying to be honest here, and I really do want to hear what your thoughts and opinions are down in the comments below. And if you agree, leave a like. If you disagree, don't. That's fine. I appreciate the input either way. I'm a new creator here, and I really want to find some kind of an audience that I can really relate to, so I'm just trying to be honest. And genuinely, I do like Pokemon a lot, and I really want them to succeed. So I'll look forward to being proven wrong in the future. But anyways, that's the show, folks. I appreciate you tuning in. And if you're interested in hearing me talk about Zelda like a lot more, then check out my playlist that I'm making and dropping the start of at the beginning of this, where I'm diving into figuring out the actual Zelda timeline. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.